also concerned that if not the letter, but certainly the spirit of one country, two systems is being breached by this matter. We've issued a statement and will continue to put pressure through diplomatic means, and will do so on an ongoing basis. But many of the concerns she points out, that she should not believe that there isn't a lot of work going on, both from our Consular General there and indeed from London, in relation to this matter.
Question number 4, Mr. Speaker.
The Minister has written to President-elect Bolsonaro. Our ambassador in Brazil has seen him, many of the future ministers and the transition team, and we look forward to working very closely with Brazil in the time ahead.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. The great Sir David Attenborough said yesterday that climate change is humanity's greatest threat. And we all know that the Amazon rainforest is known as the planet's lungs. Yet we're seeing an alarming and irreversible rate of deforestation now in the Amazon, and really worrying noises coming out of the new administration about its approach. So will the government play a very strong global leadership role in ensuring that the new administration understand its responsibility to protect the rainforest and ensure they understand the consequences if they don't?
Mr. Speaker, the answer to the Honourable Lady's question is a very clear yes. The UK, of course, is fully committed. The government comes into office on the 1st of January. The President-elect has already said that Brazil will remain a party to the Paris Agreement, and our ambassador has already discussed this with the incoming government, and we will continue to put pressure and lobby in the same way as we always do in favour of climate change legislation and adherence to the Paris Agreement.
Gregory Gamble.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In any discussions the Minister may have with the new President, would he ensure that the understanding comes across that populism, as it is sweeping across much of the democratic world, is because of mainstream administrations internationally leaving many of the populations behind, giving the rise to the populism that we see today?
Well, I understand exactly what the honourable gentleman is saying. I think that all governments need to serve the needs of all of their people. We've seen the rise of the right in quarters closer to home across Europe, including in elections, regional elections in Spain last week. And I agree that populism has its serious dangers, and we want to see all administrations serve the needs of their country as we would all wish to see.
Number 5, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We have consistently urged the Afghan government to protect the rights of all ethnic and religious groups, including the Hazaras, in line, of course, with the Afghan constitution. The FCO is deeply concerned about recent reports about security incidents affecting the Hazara community, particularly in Ghazni and Buruzan. We shall continue to call upon all parties to the conflict to protect the civilian population.
Stringer. For recent lobbying, Mr. Speaker, Hazaris lobbied me and other honourable members that they were now in deep fear of an ISIS attack on them. This is after they've suffered massacres from the Taliban and a history of genocidal attacks from other ethnic groups in Afghanistan. Given the amount of money we have put into Afghanistan, can the Minister not do more?
Well, thank the honourable gentleman for Blakely and Broughton for what he says. We do fully understand the very deep concerns about civilian casualties and displacement, and as he rightly says, not just for the Taliban, but potentially from ISIS as well. Let me just say this. Only last week, staff from the British Embassy in Kabul met with Hazara representatives for Ghazni from the Afghan government in order to hear first-hand those concerns. The Afghan National Defence Security Forces, I know, are working to stabilise the security situation and, of course, do that work in tandem with the UK forces.
In the light of the recent Taliban offences and the atrocities that occurred as a result of it, and the deep insecurity felt by the Hazara community at this moment, can the Minister say what additional support NATO's Resolute Support Mission is contributing to their safety?
I thank the honourable gentleman for his question. We are obviously working together with many of our allies at NATO level, of course, in particular. NATO's Resolute Support Mission is helping Afghans to build their own self-standing capability and capacity, and we very much hope to see the fruits of that in the years to come with the Afghan National Defence and Security Forces. That is obviously happening in a number of parts of Afghanistan. He will appreciate that we are obviously very concerned to see on the humanitarian side, particularly civilian populations, being under threat. This is going to be a long haul, and I think he will recognise, working together with allies, in particular the US, that we're no longer governed by a timetable about leaving an electoral timetable. We want to leave that country in a better place, and that means working to build up that capacity.
The UK has been working with the United Nations to agree a global compact on refugees, set for adoption by the end of the year. It provides a comprehensive global framework that goes beyond life-saving humanitarian support, enabling a longer-term response, offering refugees a viable future.
The UN's Global Compact on Refugees is indeed welcome. It recognises our common humanity and interconnectedness, but I am concerned that it is non-binding. So how will the government work to strengthen this? And will the Foreign Secretary and Home Secretary work together to review our own restrictive rules that prevent refugees' families being together?
Well, I'm glad that she welcomes the UK's role, and I can assure the Honourable Lady that the UK has been fully engaged throughout the whole process since the United Nations agreed to move forward on this, in terms of working on the wording, in terms of working on the direction of travel, and in terms of making sure that it's an agreement that can work for the whole world.
Sir Desmond Swain.
Exactly what are we signing up to at Marrakesh?
Well, we're signing up to the Global Compact on Refugees, and I want to just clarify for the House that this is a different document than the one that has generated perhaps more controversy in terms of the Global Compact on Migration.
Christine Jardine.
Mr. Speaker, following numerous political attacks, search and rescue vessels have found it very difficult to operate in the Mediterranean. And given the death toll, which MSF reckons this year is approaching 1,300 people, what is the government doing to support those NGOs who wish to provide search and rescue facilities in the Mediterranean Sea?
Well, she's right to raise this important issue, Mr. Speaker, and she will be aware that, in fact, 2 border force cutters are there right at this moment. And I know that she will welcome the fact that over the course of this operation, UK naval assets have in fact rescued more than 30,000 souls in the Mediterranean. Of course, there is further work that we're doing in terms of the UK allocation, and which so far has totalled some £175 million.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I recently attended a very humbling and moving event in Taunton Deane, which was celebrating all the Syrian families, almost 20 of them that have come to Somerset. It's a model. So I wonder if the Minister would join with me in praising and thanking the Taunton Welcomes Refugee Organisation. So many church people, individuals, council workers are all involved in this. It's just wonderful. They were so delighted. And please would the Minister also confirm our commitment to helping these most needy of Syrian refugees?
Mr. Speaker, have you ever come across in this House a representative more passionate about her constituency than the honourable member for Taunton Deane? And I'm happy to endorse what she says, also to endorse the work done within my county of Worcestershire, Mr. Speaker, and inform the House that nationally the UK is well on track to achieving our commitment of 20,000 vulnerable people resettled in the UK by 2020. In fact, as of September, I understand that total is now over 15,000.
Absolutely right. I've learnt more about Taunton Deane in the last 3 years than I knew for the previous 52. That is correct. Rachel Reeves.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Many refugees are fleeing religious persecution. The Archbishop of Canterbury has said that Christians in the Middle East are on the brink of extinction, facing the worst crisis since the 13th century in the birthplace of Christianity. What are the government doing to support Christians in the Middle East and to grant asylum to those who are fleeing that persecution?
Well, indeed, it is a very sobering Christmas thought from the Archbishop of Canterbury, and in fact 25.4 million refugees worldwide are there, and the UK, of course, stands as one of the most significant supporters of refugees, whatever their religious persuasion. There is, of course, a service in Westminster Abbey later today to which all colleagues are invited, and I know that this is an important piece of work that the UK will remain steadfast in supporting.
Would my right honourable friend outline what new mental health support is being given to the children in Lebanon and Jordan who are affected so badly by the fighting that's ongoing in Syria?
Yes, well, if the Speaker will allow me to put on my other hat from the Department for International Development just very briefly, then my honourable friend will be aware that the Secretary of State for International Development did recently announce a range of new programmes to provide support in what has been a neglected area in terms of the psychosocial support and mental health support that particularly children in refugee situations do need.
Doherty.
With permission, I'll take this with numbers 9, 12, 16 and 21. Peace talks to resolve the terrible conflict in Yemen are due to start in Stockholm tomorrow, and attendance is looking positive.
Doherty.
Grateful for the Foreign Secretary's response and for the support he's given to these critically important peace talks. What reasons does he have for thinking that the Houthis and their Iranian backers will negotiate in good faith?
I think it is difficult to know the answer to that question, because what's bedevilled these talks to date is that both sides have thought that a military victory is possible. But this is the first time for 2 years that the parties have come round a table together. And I do think the mood has changed, so I think we want to do everything we can to support it.
Much, Mr. Speaker. The UN says more than 60% of civilian deaths have been the result of Saudi-led airstrikes. Will the UK government therefore confirm that it will undertake any and all measures to ensure that Saudi Arabia is no longer armed and trained by the UK, and that every impression is made on them to reach an agreement that means that no more Yemeni civilians die at their hands?
I think, with respect to the Honourable Lady, whose views I listened to carefully, it's important to remember that the cause of this conflict was the illegal taking over of power in Yemen by the Houthis, and the Saudi military offensive was authorised by Resolution 2216. We have a relationship with Saudi Arabia which we are using to encourage them to do everything possible to come round the table and talk about peace.
Clifton Brown. Mr. Speaker, some humanitarian agencies are warning that Yemen next year could become the worst famine in a century. Is it not incumbent, therefore, that the civilised world lifts every sinew to broker a peace settlement under the auspices of Martin Griffiths, our UN Special Negotiator?
Well, I think my honourable friend speaks extremely wisely. We've got 8.5 million people on the brink of starvation, 14,000 people getting cholera every week, 85,000 children who have already died of starvation, and that's why we have to do everything possible, and Martin Griffiths, I think, is doing a fantastically good and very difficult job.
Ross Thompson.
Speaker, Houthi rebels pushed the legitimate government in Yemen from power. They have fired Iranian-backed missiles across the border into neighbouring countries and into commercial shipping lanes. So would my right honourable friend agree with me that any vote in the US Senate to withdraw American support from the coalition would undermine efforts to reach a ceasefire?
Well, I think my honourable friend is absolutely right to point out that there can be no lasting settlement to the terrible, terrible conflict in Yemen unless Iranian missiles are stopped from firing from the Yemen into Saudi Arabia and even as far as Riyadh. And that is why what we have to have is a balanced way forward that recognises both the humanitarian needs and Saudi Arabian security.
Gavin Newlands.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. The Prime Minister said yesterday that the situation in Yemen could only be resolved with that long-term political solution. In order to make that possible, should we not be strongly urging restraint on the part of the Saudis, given that when total war is being waged on civilians, often using weapons supplied by this country, it's hard for calls for a political situation to carry any meaningful weight or credibility?
Well, we are strongly urging restraint on both sides, and I recognise what he says about the urgency of the situation, but I also think it is encouraging that for the first time in 2 years, the participants are coming together in Stockholm this week.
85,000 children under the age of 5 have starved to death in Yemen over the last 3 years. Does my right honourable friend agree that a political solution is the way to a lasting peace, but more urgently, we need to ensure that imports of food can make it through the port of Hodeidah in the light of the Save the Children Fund report?
She is absolutely right, and Hodeidah opening is crucial. Also, it's important to get access to the Red Sea mills, which have enough wheat to feed 3.6 million people. The fighting has lessened, but it's still not stopped, and that's why we need these peace talks to succeed.
Rebels to be flown from Yemen to Oman. Does my right honourable friend agree with me that that flight for treatment on a UN plane is at least a good sign of goodwill in advance of peace talks, that we should pay tribute to all those involved and be hopeful for the future?
Yes, my honourable friend is absolutely right, and that was one of the conditions that the Houthis made for their participation in these talks in Stockholm, and the Saudi agreement to do that was actually announced when I was in Riyadh a few weeks ago.
Mr. Stephen Twigg.
It's hugely welcome and encouraging that these peace talks in Stockholm are finally starting tomorrow. Can the Foreign Secretary update us in parallel what is happening on getting a new UN Security Council resolution?
Well, I'm very happy to do that. We've circulated a text, and the truth is that we will finalise that text after these talks have concluded. If we could choose what the text would say, we would love it to be announcing a ceasefire. But there's no point doing that unless it's agreed by all the parties, and that's why we want the peace talks to succeed.
Ms. Keithers.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I thank the Foreign Secretary for the amount of time he has spent on the Yemen issue since assuming office. This is a very special moment. The guaranteed treatment of the Houthis in Oman is critical, but can I ask him whether he would go to Stockholm on one of the days and show the support at the highest level of this government for the peace process?
Well, in principle, I have no problem with doing anything whatsoever that will help this process along, because, as my honourable friend on this side of the House said earlier, this is by far the worst humanitarian crisis in the world today, and possibly the worst that we've had for 100 years. I would always be guided by Martin Griffiths, though, as to whether my presence would be helpful.
Sir Vincent Cable.
As long as the bombing continues, can the Foreign Secretary describe the surveillance which British embassy officials have over the activities of the Saudi Air Force as required by export licence conditions?
Well, he's absolutely right to point that out. Indeed, he oversaw those export conditions when he was working in government. And it is because of the contracts that we have with the Saudis that we are very closely involved in looking at things like their targeting to make sure that they are indeed compliant with international humanitarian law.
Emily Thornberry.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And can I thank the Foreign Secretary for his update on the Yemen peace talks? I'd like to ask him some more questions about the UK's draft UN resolution. Can I ask him a question that I've asked 3 times now, at the dispatch box, by letter and in a written parliamentary question, without ever getting an answer? And yet it's such a simple question, Mr. Speaker. Did the version of the draft UN resolution shown to Crown Prince Salman by the Foreign Secretary on the 12th of November include a call for independent investigations of war crimes, yes or no?
Well, first of all, I did not show a text of the draft resolution to King Salman or the Crown Prince when I went to Saudi Arabia, but I can confirm that both the original text and the current text refers to international humanitarian law. But in the process of getting that text agreed, did we make compromises to please the Saudis? Yes. Did we make compromises to please the Houthis? Yes, we did. And it's a result of that diplomacy that talks are happening this week. And rather than criticising that, he should be celebrating the brilliant work done by British diplomats.
Emily Thornberry.
It would be very helpful if in those circumstances, Mr. Speaker, if the Secretary of State would put a version of that draft resolution in the House of Commons library so that we can all see it for ourselves. And in the meantime, Mr. Speaker, the House will be aware that in the US Senate this week, they are due to vote on whether America should continue supporting the Saudi assault on Yemen, even as millions of children face starvation. If the Foreign Secretary genuinely believes in the sovereignty of this Parliament, when will he show it? When will he ask members of this House to vote on whether the UK's support for this war can any longer be justified?
I just simply say to her, when it comes to the question of arms exports to Saudi Arabia, she seems to feel rather more strongly about it today than she did in 2007 when Labour Foreign Office Minister Kim Howells talked about shared values with Saudi Arabia following a big arms deal. And the truth is that we follow the guidelines put in place by a Labour government. And that's what we do. They are the strictest in the world. And if she wants to change that, she should say so.
Uzi Cooper.
Number 10, please, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The FCO's 2017 Human Rights and Democracy Report demonstrates the very breadth of issues we work upon and how we mobilise our diplomatic network to champion universal rights. This, of course, includes freedom of religion or belief, and as a testament to that commitment, on the 4th of July, the Prime Minister appointed my FCO colleague Lord Ahmed to the role of Special Envoy on FORB, an end to which I can assure this House he works tirelessly.
Rosie Cooper.
The biggest recipient of UK aid, Pakistan, has received £2.8 billion over the last 20 years. That's nearly £400,000 a day. Shouldn't we suspend aid until Pakistan promotes freedom of religion and belief for its minorities and allows an innocent woman, Asia Bibi, falsely imprisoned for 9 years, to leave Pakistan? And shouldn't we be offering her asylum in the United Kingdom?
May I answer this question, Mr. Speaker, because I know it's a question a number of members have concerns about. As the Prime Minister stated, our primary concern is the safety and security of Asia Bibi and her family. We want to see a swift and positive resolution to the legal aspects of this case in Pakistan. I should perhaps say one allied nation has for some years been in detailed discussions about providing a safe destination for Asia Bibi and her family once that current legal process is complete. The House will appreciate that going into details on these discussions would compromise that safety.
Speaker, having recently returned from the Holy Land with a cross-party delegation of women MPs and indeed your chaplain, Mr. Speaker, I'm very concerned about the human rights abuses that I saw. Would the Minister agree that there is a renewed urgency to find a solution to the conflict in this area?
Yeah, no, may I thank my honourable friend, my right honourable friend, for her questions. I couldn't agree more. We are going to continue to work as closely as we can with all parties. As I pointed out, we do a lot of work underneath the radar. I know the Foreign Secretary and my honourable friend, the member for North East Bedfordshire, work very closely in relation to these issues and will continue to do so, to looking after the rights of religious minorities across the world.
Mr. Speaker, my constituents brought me this message from their friends in Cameroon about Kumbo. It's a dead town. Their crisis is intensifying and roadblocks have been intensified. Everyone has gone to the villages. Villages are hosting refugees in Kumbo. The gendarmes have started shooting civilians carelessly. Pray for us in Kumbo. No way to supply essential goods from Bamida. But what I would like to ask the Secretary of State is what it is doing to protect the human rights, particularly in the Anglophone areas of the Cameroon.
I know that my honourable friend, the Minister for Asia, has been recently in Cameroon and speaks regularly with counterparts in that regard. We are extremely concerned, obviously, about the issues in the Anglophone area, not least, of course, as the Honourable Lady will be well aware, there is a considerable amount of work that goes on with Boko Haram in that porous border between Cameroon and Nigeria. We continue to do all that we can, as you say, to protect the interests, particularly in the Anglophone-related area, and we'll do so going forward.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Cambridge PhD student Peter B.R. Ajak was detained without charge by the authorities in South Sudan in July for doing nothing more than speaking out on the human rights of his fellow citizens. The government said at the time that this was of great concern. So can the Minister tell us what action has been taken since then to secure Peter's release?
I thank the honourable lady for her question. It is actually my honourable friend for Africa, the Minister of Africa, who deals with these matters. We remain appalled and, by the conflict and by the deteriorating humanitarian situation in South Sudan. We welcome a regionally led peace agreement signed on the 12th of September. We believe that is the only real chance and opportunity going forward for the people of South Sudan who have suffered for so long. There are positive steps, but I would accept, as the honourable lady has pointed out, that progress is very slow and inconsistent. We welcome reductions in violence, and obviously we work with our mission there to try and ensure, as far as possible, that we move towards a ceasefire, violations coming to an end.
Sir.
We are very concerned at the increasing number of attacks on journalists throughout the world, which is why next summer we plan to host a major conference on protecting media freedom in London.
I'm grateful for that answer. This is an issue close to my heart. Will the Foreign Secretary confirm that the UK government will continue to press other countries to protect the freedoms, rights and securities of journalists, wherever they might be working and however inconvenient their reporting might be in those jurisdictions?
Well, I'm very happy to confirm that. And when I was in Burma, I talked to Aung San Suu Kyi about the two Reuters journalists, Wallon and Cho So-u, who we have very serious concerns about how due process was applied. We should remember in this House that in the last year that it's recorded 65 journalists were killed, and 9 out of 10 times no perpetrators were brought to justice.
Chairman. Mr. Speaker, the Foreign Secretary knows that out of Europe we are more and more not only under the radar but on the periphery of the periphery. Will he, meantime, speak to the President of the International Rescue Committee, because the plight of journalists, the plight of aid workers are very similar in terms of the dangers they have to face doing good work. Will he talk to David Miliband about that?
Well, I did meet David Miliband when I went to New York in September, and I think it would be a very good idea to have those discussions. But we have great concerns about the safety of aid workers, of course. But the concern we have with respect to journalists is the fact that this seems to be a trend that is increasing, and it does seem to be the new border between free and unfree countries.
Mr. Speaker, the BBC are still banned from Rwanda. Is the Secretary of State hopeful that that ban will be overturned by the Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting in 2020?
Well, my honourable friend, the Minister of Africa, has just indicated to me she's very hopeful that ban will be overturned before then.
Ah, yes, the Political Studies Association Backbencher of the Year, Diana Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I listened carefully to what the Foreign Secretary said about Iran and journalists, and I wondered, with the UN Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Expression, David Kay, describing the recent attacks in the state media in Iran and online in Iran about the BBC Persian service as deplorable, what more can we do to support those journalists who so bravely work in the BBC Persian service?
Can I, too, congratulate the Backbencher of the Year and say I raised this issue when I was in Tehran on the 19th of November. I pointed out to the Iranian government that if they are unhappy with the coverage of BBC Persia, there's a very simple thing they can do, which is allow their representatives to be interviewed on it and allow them to put their point of view across, to which they smiled and changed the subject. But we continue to press on that point.
In more.
13, Mr. Speaker.
We will continue to work with international partners to drive progress to tackle this terrible crime and deliver the commitments made at October's London conference. 57 countries have adopted the conference's declaration so far.
Damien Moore.
Can my honourable friend update the House on the progress that's been made towards the government's target of halving the number of elephants killed for ivory by 2024?
Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, we're leading from the front. As the honourable gentleman knows, we are bringing in an ivory ban here in the UK. We've formed a high-level political coalition, the Ivory Alliance 2024, and we are urging everyone to tackle something which is extremely urgent, because the number of African elephants has actually declined by 30% over the last 7 years.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Could I ask the Minister, who will share all of our concerns with this illegal wildlife trade, to redouble their efforts to get other countries involved as well as their own, to get international organisations involved? It is deplorable what's happened, and the wildlife across this planet are disappearing before our eyes.
Well, Mr. Speaker, can I thank him for his endorsement of the work, and we truly are working very, very energetically and vigorously with the incredibly important and wide-ranging conference. And as I say, 1,000 people attended that, 57 countries have signed up to the declaration, and we're encouraging everyone and leading by example in terms of our ivory ban.
But I don't want Lewis or Stockton to lose out, so extreme brevity is required. Maria Caulfield.
Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The recent upsurge in violence in Gaza reminds all of us of the need to ensure that the Middle East peace process gets moving, because that's the only thing that will make a difference. Both the Foreign Secretary and myself have recently seen US Envoy Jason Greenblatt, and we will continue all our efforts in relation to this.
Mr. Speaker, the UN General Assembly is scheduled to vote on Thursday on a US-sponsored resolution condemning Hamas for the increasing violence and attacks on civilians and worsening the situation in Gaza. Will the UK government be supporting that resolution?
Well, Mr. Speaker, we don't disclose the intention to vote in advance. What I would say is it's very clear. We condemn Hamas's action and conduct. We call for a permanent end to its terror and rocket attacks in relation to Israel. We continue to prescribe the military wing of Hamas, have sanctions against individuals, and have no contact with Hamas.
Mr. Speaker, given the government's view, which I know the Minister shares, that Israeli settlements are illegal under international law, why does the government allow the import of goods from those settlements and investment by British companies?
We allow the import of goods, but the labelling makes it clear so that customers can make their own choice about whether or not they buy goods from those areas.
What assessment has my honourable friend made of the terror tunnels that have been discovered between Lebanon by Hezbollah into Israel?
I think it demonstrates continually the threat that there is towards the State of Israel from those who would mean it harm, but again it emphasises the need, which I'm sure the whole House shares, to ensure that there is a resolution of the issues between Israel and its neighbours, so that there can be permanent peace and security for all in the region.
Ministers keep telling us they want to wait and see President Trump's long-awaited Middle East peace plan. In the meantime, we've seen an escalation of violence, death on the Gaza border, worsening humanitarian crisis, continued demolition of Palestinian homes, and the ending of US support for the UN Relief and Works Agency. Isn't it time the UK said very clearly that you cannot have a two-state solution if you only recognise one state?
What we've said very clearly is we do recognise a two-state solution. We're keen to make sure that when the envoy's proposals come forward, they get a strong reception and people are able to work on them to try and bring a resolution to this long-standing crisis. It is the only thing that will deal with the concerns which he raised.
Finally, Jeremy Lefroy.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. What work? I beg your pardon. Number 24.
Mr. Speaker, congratulations for getting through the whole order paper. We are opening posts in Chad, Niger, Eswatini, Lesotho and Djibouti, and increasing the number of staff working on Africa by up to 1/3.
Jeremy Lefroy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. With the African Union developing the Continental Free Trade Area, what additional resources is the government putting into Addis Ababa to deal with the increasing opportunities in working with the African Union?
Well, the honourable gentleman is absolutely right to highlight the importance of the African Union and its work in Addis Ababa. And over the course of the years to come, we are increasing the number of posts working with the African Union by, I think, a number of 12.
Thank you. Yes, no need to be perplexed. We proceed happily now to topical questions and to the voice of Taunton Dean. Rebecca Powell.
Topical number 1, Mr. Speaker.
Foreign Secretary.
Mr. Speaker, given the stresses and strains in British politics at the moment, I thought I might share with the House some good news, which is that we will be opening a new British embassy in the Maldives. This small country has made important strides towards democracy with the recent elections, and we wish to extend it every support possible, no doubt supported by a number of colleagues making fact-finding visits.
I wonder if the Foreign Secretary is himself opening the said embassy, or if he's generous enough to devolve it to his deputy. Rebecca Powell.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'll be first up for coming on the opening visit. Does my right honourable friend agree that through programmes including the Prosperity Fund, but particularly working with other MPs and other parliaments in developing countries, that the UK could establish itself as a leader in accelerating renewable energy, electric cars and other business opportunities to promote sustainable development and climate action in developing countries?
Mr. Speaker, given that it's parliamentary democracy that we wish to encourage in the Maldives, I think you might be, on this occasion, the right person to go there on this important occasion. And I'm happy to expedite the process as soon as possible if it would help. And I completely agree with my honourable friend about the importance of zero emissions, and Britain can certainly play a leading role.
Luke Pollard.
Speaker, will the Minister recognise that after the illegal salvage of HMS Exeter from the Java Sea, we need a Rex at-risk register to ensure our lost Royal Navy ships, those war graves around the world, are not forgotten and are properly protected? And will the Minister agree to meet with me to discuss how we can work internationally to create that register?
A nice, easy one. I should perhaps say that I was the last British Minister to be in Male, the capital of the Maldives, and I wouldn't recommend it for more than a weekend. The islands around might be a little more fun, so that I think is why my right honourable friend is suggesting you should go there, Mr. Speaker. You'll be glad, but I'll keep it simple, if I may, to the honourable gentleman from Plymouth. Yes, of course, I'll be happy to meet him at any point.
Very good.
Stephen Kerr.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. What is the government doing to work with the Nigerian government to promote reconciliation between the Fulani herders and the villagers and farmers of the Middle Belt?
Good question.
Mr. Speaker, well, I know my honourable friend took part in the Westminster Hall debate that took place thanks to the honourable member for Strangford and the Backbench Business Committee last week. And in that I outlined the way in which our High Commission is working not only with the government but with the state government, but also with community leaders, religious leaders, and offering its help to support reconciliation and mediation in this growing crisis.
Earlier this year, in response to deaths on the Gaza border, the Minister said the government would support Israel's investigation into those deaths, and they would be pushing for an international element to those investigations. How's he getting on with that?
We're still pressing the Israeli authorities in relation to exactly what we've previously said. That's the best way to try and find an answer to the tragedy that happened in Gaza.
Alan Mack.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Chevening Awards help Britain to engage young people from across the world. What support is my honourable friend giving to British embassies and missions in the Greater China regions to promote these important awards?
Honourable friend is absolutely right about the soft power access of Chevening Scholarship Programme, which creates lasting positive relationships with future leaders, influencers and decision makers from 145 countries around the world. We now have some 50,000 Chevening alumni since the project was set up in 1983, and last year, with 75 scholars, China was the single largest part of our Chevening ambition.
Is the Minister aware if there's any Foreign Office warnings to tourists going to Malta over what is apparently a dodgy legal system? And would he be good enough to meet with me to discuss a particular injustice to a family in my constituency to see if he's available to help?
As with all countries, I would urge anyone thinking of travelling anywhere to look at the travel advice which we offer in a very disciplined way through the Foreign Office on our website. But should the honourable gentleman wish to discuss an individual case, then of course I'd be very happy to see him as he asks.
Martin Vickers.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As Vice Chairman of the All-Party Group for Albania, I and colleagues met with the Ambassador and Albanian politicians last week. They're very keen on developing business links with the UK in view of the Foreign Secretary's initiative to have more business leaders involved to work alongside our diplomats. Could I urge him and the government to engage with Albania and other Western Balkan countries to develop our links?
Yes, Mr. Speaker, the Foreign Secretary indeed does wish to widen the pool of talent from which we select ambassadors, but irrespective of that initiative, we're very keen, of course, to develop economic and commercial ties with Albania. We will do that, and of course in conjunction with the Department of International Trade. But one thing that, of course, would help those commercial opportunities would be if Albania itself reforms its justice sector.
Tom Bray.
Speaker. Mr Rajapaksa playing any role in the Sri Lankan government will terrify many communities in Sri Lanka, particularly the Tamil community. Will the Minister set out the UK government's position in relation to Mr Rajapaksa's re-emergence into Sri Lankan politics?
We are very concerned by the chaotic political situation currently in Sri Lanka, to which the right honourable gentleman refers. It is causing great damage politically and economically to that country. I have made public statements on the 26th and 29th of October, on the 9th of November, and as he knows, at the All-Party Group earlier this week for the Tamil interest. We will continue actively to coordinate our response within the international community in Colombo and indeed at the UN.
Sir Hugo Swire.
Further to that last question, my right honourable friend is aware that all parties are in court today again in Colombo. Can my right honourable friend tell me what conversations he's had with fellow ministers of the Commonwealth, what conversations as Chair of the Commonwealth he's had with the Secretary-General of the Commonwealth, and what message he can give to the judges in Colombo to ensure that they uphold the Constitution of Sri Lanka?
Well, first and foremost, we want this to be resolved by Sri Lanka in line with its own constitution and laws. We welcome the statement made on the 5th of November by the Commonwealth Secretary-General, whom I understand is meeting the Foreign Secretary tomorrow to discuss a range of matters, but obviously Sri Lanka will be very much at the forefront of the conversation. We want to encourage ongoing dialogue, and we want to offer the Commonwealth support, if required, for the government and the people of Sri Lanka. We are obviously in an ongoing dialogue with the Commonwealth and other partners to ensure a coordinated international response.
Ian Austin.
Speaker, and I'm sure I speak for all members of the Foreign Affairs Select Committee when I say how much we're looking forward to scrutinising the work of our new embassy in the Maldives. But in the meantime, could I ask what assessment the government's made of the human rights of Palestinians living under the brutal dictatorship of Hamas, which routinely imprisons people without trial, tortures them, executes people, and is reported today to have sentenced 6 people to death? And doesn't this, along with the indiscriminate attacks on Israel, show why Hamas is the main barrier to the peace process we all want to see?
Yes, Mr. Speaker. There's all too little emphasis on looking at the rule of Hamas in Gaza and the human rights abuses that are conducted, not least the pushing of people towards the fence during the course of the summer, which has led to some of the deaths and woundings that have taken place. That's why we have a long-standing policy of no contact with Hamas.
Honourable friends update the House on the work they're doing with the Department for International Trade on securing the UK accession to the WTO's government procurement agreement.
Yes, I'm very happy to announce that we were successful in our application to join the GPA, and we were strongly supported by a number of allies all over the world.
Carol Monaghan.
Speaker, the 3.9 million Christians in Pakistan are amongst the most persecuted in the world. Can the Secretary of State assure the House that he is working with colleagues in the Department for International Trade to make sure that any future trade deals are not made at the expense of these people?
I can assure the Honourable Lady, and I know that my Foreign Secretary also feels the same way, that clearly this is a major concern. As she rightly points out, we want to have trade deals with that country, we want to normalise relations, but we are particularly concerned about the religious belief freedom, which applies not just to Christians, but actually to many other religious minorities in that country.
Andrew Bowie.
Speaker, on a recent visit to Sweden, I was rather disturbed to see being delivered to every household a leaflet entitled Om krisen eller kriget kommer, which translated as If Crisis or War Comes. So can my right honourable friend confirm we are doing all we can, standing by and supporting our close allies, not just in Sweden, but across Scandinavia and the Baltic, who see themselves on the front line of this new Cold War?
Mr. Speaker, apart from his primary duty of defending his Swedish wife, I think that I can confirm to him that we are, of course, not in any way resiling from our commitment to defend our friends and to understand growing threats in Eastern Europe and also to the north.
Jim Cunningham.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. The Foreign Secretary said earlier that they'd achieved a great deal from the EU as part of the government's proposals. What parts has the Foreign Secretary not achieved of the deal?
Well, I think, as I said earlier in the session, we have achieved a large part of what we achieved, and the question is whether, by accepting this deal, we can go on and achieve everything that we want, and I believe we can.
Jeremy Lefroy.
What assessment has the Minister for Africa made of the preparations for the forthcoming elections in the Democratic Republic of Congo, which are so vital?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I can share with the House that our assessment is that they are on track to take place in accordance with the Accord of Saint-Sylvestre, which is the 23rd of December. And he will know that the UK has been very involved in funding 20,000 of the 60,000 election observers who will be there to observe the process.
McMorrin.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My constituent, Mr. Nkembo, is from Cameroon. Many of his close members of his family have been shot and killed and their villages burnt. What urgent action has the Secretary of State taken or will be taken, and what will he say to my constituents?
Well, I can say to her constituent that she's absolutely right to raise this very serious situation, that the UK government is doing everything it can to encourage the government in Cameroon to engage in a dialogue with what has become an increasingly armed separatist movement, and indeed that we are working with the United Nations in terms of what further assistance can be given to the populations who are being displaced in this crisis.
Thank you. Order. Presentation of bill. Mr. David Linden. Second reading what day?
Friday the 25th of January 2019.
Friday the 25th of January 2019. Thank you. Order. 10-minute rule motion. John Howell.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I beg that leave be given to bring in a bill to limit the grounds of appeal against decisions on planning applications that are consistent with a neighbourhood development plan and local plan and for connected purposes. I am moving this bill today to try to provide reassurance to those communities who spend considerable amounts of time and money producing a neighbourhood plan, that their work is valued, that it plays an important part in the planning system and in the determination of planning applications, and that together with the local plan produced by the district or borough council, it is a fundamental document.
Order. It is something of a discourtesy to the honourable gentleman, the member for Henley, who is moving his 10-minute rule motion. It might not be front and centre stage in the minds of all honourable and right honourable members, but it's extremely important to the honourable gentleman and to a lot of people. And whether people are interested in listening or not, they should do the honourable gentleman the courtesy of affording him a respectful silence. Mr. John Howell.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. That it is a fundamental document and that the effort made in producing it is worthwhile. In my own constituency, 2 more neighbourhood plans recently passed at referendum by 94% and 98%, showing how much they are valued by communities. This bill is to show that where a district and parish have taken control of the planning requirements of their area, that view is an important and determining one for taking applications forward. I do this having held the position of government champion for neighbourhood planning, and in that role I have been around the country talking to groups of parish councils and their members of parliament about why they should produce a neighbourhood plan. I'm grateful for the large number of colleagues who have supported this bill, far more than the 11 supporter slots available. In my own constituency, at a village called Sonning Common, the local community and district council are reported to have spent £90,000 defending the village's new neighbourhood plan against an appeal. The subject of the appeal was an application for 95 dwellings on a site located in the neighbourhood plan for just 26. Why this application was able to be taken to appeal is part of the reason for this bill. The application was inconsistent with the Sonning Common neighbourhood plan, and there were no mitigating circumstances otherwise. Local residents had worked very hard on the neighbourhood plan and indeed continue to do so. The question we have to ask is why was the existence of the neighbourhood plan not sufficient? In order to set the scene for this bill, let me go back to what prompted me and the then Minister of Planning, the Right Honourable Member for Tunbridge Wells, to introduce neighbourhood plans in 2011-12. The starting point was the recognition that the previous system of taking parish views on applications into account by ticking one of 3 boxes was inadequate. The boxes were yes, no and no firm opinion. As we live in a plan-led system, it was crucial that anything that replaced it was part of the plan-led system, hence a new plan, the neighbourhood plan. This has proved to be a much better way of crystallising local views of development. The neighbourhood plan becomes part of the local development plan when it is approved at referendum and thereby carries the full legal weight that the local plan does. It is not a NIMBY charter. The plan needs to conform with the strategic objectives of the local plan, particularly the housing numbers, which should be seen as a minimum figure, and they have in practice allocated some 10% more sites than originally detailed by the district or borough council. So far, around 2,500 communities around the country are producing a neighbourhood plan. A high number have already passed referendum, with North Korean-style majorities. Despite the work of the local plan expert group on which I serve, wanting to simplify the production of neighbourhood plans, it is a process which is becoming more complex and time-consuming for ordinary people to carry out. And I pay tribute to the volunteers who spend so much of their time putting these plans together. But there is a bigger problem with this which this bill seeks to address. Let me explain. Imagine you are a parish which has committed money and considerable amounts of time to producing a neighbourhood plan. You have been through the exercise of allocating sites. You may even have allocated more than you were told was appropriate by the district council. A developer wants to make a planning application which falls outside of the neighbourhood plan. He makes that application. It is rightly refused as being not in accordance with the neighbourhood plan. Yet he is still able to put in appeal to the planning inspectorate. That appeal will need to be defended. It will require vast amounts of time from local people who put the plan together. It may require the services of a QC. It may require the services of other specialists depending on the nature of the defence. Like at Sonning Common, they and the district council may end up having to spend around £100,000 on defending it. However, the chances of the neighbourhood plan being upheld are open to doubt. In other words, all that effort and all that money could be wasted. The question I'm always asked is why, when we have a neighbourhood plan, should the developer be allowed to make an appeal? So how does this bill work? Let me give 3 examples. First, we have the situation where there is a robust 5-year housing land supply in place, or indeed, where appropriate, a 3-year housing land supply, and a fully approved neighbourhood plan and local plan. In this case, a developer makes an application for development which is contrary to the neighbourhood plan and is earmarked for refusal on the basis of neighbourhood plan policy. In making its decision, the local plan authority decides first that the application is outside of the plan or contravenes a policy in it and refuses it. It also makes a formal decision which is published as a formal notice in the minutes of the planning committee that the application is contrary to the neighbourhood plan. In other words, that the neighbourhood plan holds sway. In this case, the developer would have no right of appeal, which would be withdrawn. In the second case, there is still a 5 or a 3-year housing land supply, but in reaching its decision, the local planning authority does not follow due process. It takes a decision about which there are legitimate processual errors. It is not possible to evaluate the significance or impact of those errors and whether that would ensure that the decision can be overturned or whether it would make no difference at all. In this case, too, the finding of fact is the application is contrary to a neighbourhood plan. In this case, the developer would have to make an initial referral to the courts by way of judicial review of the processual issues, meaning that the bar for a decision was a high one in which he would seek leave to appeal to the planning inspectorate. It would be for the court to review the processual errors rather than the issue of fact. Finally, in the third example, there is no 5 or 3-year housing land supply in place, but the local planning authority still refuses the application. In this case, the rights of the developer to appeal the application to the planning inspectorate would continue as now. The effect of this would be multifold. First, it will send a strong message to developers that neighbourhood plans are to be taken seriously. I am fully aware of one developer who has devoted considerable resource to undermining neighbourhood plans and regularly puts in objections to local planning authorities. The issuing of a notice by the local planning authority makes it clear that there is a finding of fact that the application is contrary to a neighbourhood plan. Second, it is only by doing this that we will return real democracy to towns and villages of this country as we originally envisaged in the Localism Act. It will have no bad effect on the housing numbers. As I said, neighbourhood plans provide for some 10% more housing than originally envisaged. It could even make it more attractive for towns and villages to allocate land for more houses, knowing that they will be protected from rapacious interests. Thirdly, it will also give towns and villages confidence that producing a neighbourhood plan is worthwhile and will be seen as producing a determinant for the planning system. Lastly, this can be seen as another step in the reform of the neighbourhood planning system, which has adapted to changing circumstances throughout. First, there was the Barwell ministerial statement, which reduced under certain circumstances the housing land supply to 3 years. More recently, it has included changes to simplify the process for updating a neighbourhood plan. Lastly, it will encourage communities to prepare plans, including local district and borough councils, and to support neighbourhood plans. In the local plan expert group, we quote the then National Planning Policy Framework, that plans, and I quote, should be the key to delivering sustainable development that reflects the vision and aspirations of local communities. But we also commented that less than a third of the country was suitably covered. There are many examples of good practice in plan making. This bill adds to that stock of good practice.
Question is that the honourable member have leave to bring in the bill. As many as are that opinion say aye. Aye. The contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. Who will prepare and bring in the bill?
Sir Oliver Letwin, Sir Nicholas Soames, Sir David Evanet, Nick Herbert, Sir Geoffrey Clifton-Brown, David Hanson, Kevin Hollingray, Gillian Keegan, Victoria Prentice, Damian Moore, and Stephen Lloyd, and myself, sir.
As far as he could.
He did, yes. Well, he does always sit there. He wasn't being contrary, that's where he normally is.
John Howell.
Planning Appeals Bill.
Second reading what day?
Friday the 25th of January 2019.
Friday the 25th of January 2019. Thank you. Order. The Right Honourable Gentleman, the Member for Holborn and St Pancras, has tabled a motion for debate on a matter of privilege which I have agreed should take precedence today. I must inform the House that I have selected the amendment in the name of the Leader of the House. To move the motion, I call Keir Starmer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I move this motion in my name and in the names of the relevant spokespeople for the SNP, the Liberal Democrats, the DUP, Plaid Cymru and the Green Party. Mr. Speaker, the issue before this House on this motion is very simple. Has the government complied with the order made by this House on the 19th of November this year to publish the full and final legal advice by the Attorney-General to the Cabinet concerning the EU withdrawal agreement and the framework for the future relationship? Yes or no? That order was binding. Mr. Speaker, on the 13th of November, I sought your advice on that issue, and you ruled in the following terms. The ruling I give is simply that the motion is effective. I have been advised thus. It is not an expression of the opinion of the House, it is an expression of the will of the House that certain documents should be provided to it. Yesterday, the government published a reasoned position paper. That was not legal advice. It simply described the deal. It was a synopsis. It was in the nature of an explainer having already been published when the deal was published. It was a long way from legal advice. The attorney made a statement to the House, and then he answered questions. But the government did not publish the full and final advice by the Attorney-General to the Cabinet. Mr. Speaker, that is the long and short of it. The government is wilfully refusing to comply with a binding order of this House, and that is contempt. Mr. Speaker, yesterday the Attorney-General as good as admitted it when he said, and I quote, "I wish that I could comply with the request of the House, but if I did, I sincerely believe it would not be in all our interests." And slightly later he said, "Although the House says I should disclose, I believe that the public interest compels me not to do so." I'm sorry. Mr. Speaker, that's a plea of mitigation, it's not a defence. I make 3 points about the government's position. First, as the honourable member for North East Somerset made clear yesterday, for the Attorney-General to say that in his view it's not in the national interest is not good enough. The honourable member for North East Somerset went on to say, and I quote, "When the government loses a vote, they must follow the will of this House under a humble address, according to all precedent. It is no longer a matter for the government to judge. It has been decided by this House, which is a higher authority." Mr. Speaker, my second point is this. If the Attorney-General feels so strongly about this matter that he is prepared now to put the government in contempt of Parliament for refusing to comply with a binding order, why on earth did he not vote against the order in the first place? Or anybody else on the government benches? That wasn't an oversight. The government knew very well what was being asked for. The Attorney-General must have known what was being debated and voted on. Yet it appears from answers given by the Attorney-General yesterday that he was not asked before that vote for his views on the wisdom of not voting against the order. Nor did he offer any advice, directly or indirectly. Again, Mr. Speaker, I quote the Attorney-General. "I had no discussion with the Chief Whip on this subject. None was sought." Now, I don't doubt the Attorney-General's word for a minute, but really? Before that vote, nobody asked the Attorney-General's views on the consequence of not opposing the order. The truth is that the decision not to oppose the order was a political decision taken by the government because it feared it would lose the vote. Mr. Speaker, they didn't want the short-term humiliation of losing a vote, and the price of that was higher than voting against the order. And none of them did it. Mr. Speaker, that's not for the first time. I will in a moment. That's not for the first time. For months, the government has ignored Opposition Day motions, and now their tactic has got them into very deep water indeed. The government cannot come to this House and say, we took a political decision not to oppose the making of the order to publish the full and final advice by the Attorney-General, and then we took a decision not to comply with that order, but somehow we're not in contempt of Parliament.
Sounds pretty contemptuous to me.
The third point I make, Mr. Speaker, is this, and it's about the government's amendment. It's about the government's amendment in the name of the Leader of the House, asking this House to refer the matter of whether the government's response fulfils the motion of the Committee of Privileges. Mr. Speaker, the short point is this. There is nothing to refer. A binding order was made, and the government is refusing to comply with it. The reality is, yet again, by its amendment, the government is simply playing for time in the hope that this ends up in the long grass until the crucial vote is long gone. So, Mr. Speaker, this motion is extremely important. It has huge constitutional and political significance. Bringing the motion is not something I have done lightly. On the contrary, Mr. Speaker, on the contrary,
Order. I don't need somebody yelling rather stupidly from a sedentary position, give way. The right honourable and learned gentleman will give way if and when he wants to do so. And that's the end of the matter. And the same will apply when the Leader of the House is on her feet. Let me just make it clear, these are extremely serious matters, and the public is entitled to expect that this debate will be conducted with courtesy. However long it takes, that is what will happen. Keir Starmer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I've not taken the decision lightly because I understand the constitutional and political significance of this motion. On the contrary, we have raised points of order on a number of occasions about this order. We've asked urgent questions, and I have repeatedly urged the government to reconsider its position, both publicly and privately, making it clear of the consequence of not doing so. But the government has chosen not to do so. I urge the government now, even at this 11th hour, to think again, to stop, to pull back from the brink of being found in contempt of Parliament. This motion, Mr. Speaker, is a last resort. The issue before us is simple. This House passed a binding order. The government is willfully refusing to comply with that order. That is contempt of Parliament.
Order. Yes, the right honourable and learned gentleman has very clearly completed his speech. The question is, as on the order paper, to move the amendment. I call the Leader of the House, Andrea Leadsom.
I beg to move the amendment in my name on the order paper. In responding to this motion, I want to start by thanking my right honourable and learned friend, the Attorney-General, for putting himself at the disposal of the House yesterday for over 2 hours to provide information about the legal impact of the withdrawal agreement. He did so with his characteristic candour and integrity. The use of this motion has happened very rarely in the history of Parliament, and I don't think any member of this House can be in any doubt that the information that the Attorney-General provided yesterday was a very frank assessment of the legal position. The questions posed by members on all sides addressed the key issues we must all consider on the legal effect of the withdrawal agreement. And my right honourable friend responded to all of those questions in a comprehensive fashion. Alongside yesterday's nearly 2.5-hour session, the Government has also provided a 48-page legal commentary which sets out the legal effect of each part of the withdrawal agreement. The information provided to the House is the detailed legal position on the withdrawal agreement, and as the Attorney-General said to the House yesterday, he continues to be at the disposal of parliamentarians to answer further questions. I would therefore, in responding to the contempt motion before us today, urge the House to exercise caution in this matter. The issue at hand is not one of substantive content. As yesterday's questioning illustrated, there is no real dispute as to the meaning and legal effect of the withdrawal agreement, and the Attorney-General could not have been clearer about the legal position yesterday. In fact, Mr. Speaker, no honourable member could say in all honesty that the Attorney-General has done anything other than treat this House with the greatest of respect. There can be no question that he or the Government has acted in a manner which is contemptuous of this House.
I'm very grateful to her for giving way, and she says that the Attorney-General answered with candour. Indeed, he did, because he made it absolutely clear that what he was doing when he said, although the House says I should disclose, I believe the public interest compels me not to, he made it absolutely clear that he was, quite deliberately, in contempt of this Parliament.
Well, the honourable gentleman, in my opinion, is not correct, and as I have just set out, the Attorney-General answered questions from all members with the most frank and clear possible legal position. So the issue we are debating today is the Government's duty to protect law officers' advice, which is in the national interest.
I'm very grateful to the leader for giving way. Does she share my disquiet with some of the sincerity spoken by the honourable and learned gentleman who opened the debate? The letter which he has tabled, calling for this motion, was signed and sealed by Thursday lunchtime yesterday. They clearly had on Thursday. They clearly had no interest in what our right honourable friend the attorney had to say on Monday.
Well, I agree with my honourable friend that certainly this House needs to exercise some caution, and I would like to explain precisely why. The issue we are debating today is the Government's duty to protect law officers' advice, which is in the national interest. This House has previously recognised the importance of the principle that information cannot always be disclosed. This is always guided by the need to protect the broader public interest. This is directly reflected in the Freedom of Information Act of 2000, brought in under a Labour government, which sets out a careful scheme for balancing the twin imperatives of transparency on the one hand and of safeguarding the public interest on the other. The consequences of not following those principles are obvious. The House might request, by way of a humble address, information that could compromise national security or which might put the lives of our troops in danger.
Obviously, parliamentary sovereignty and the duty of government to obey motions is extremely important to this House. But my honourable friend is rightly saying there's another problem of the confidentiality of legal advice, which Labour and Conservative governments also need as well. Isn't there a sensible solution to this, as opposed to this party political exchange at the moment, that the opposition agree to receive a confidential briefing on Privy Council terms, look at the documents, and have the attorney point out those parts which, in everybody's view, might damage the national interest, damage the negotiating position of any government of any party, and, in effect, agree to redact the documents, the politically embarrassing bits, which is what the opposition are after, and all the rest of it, they can come out. But with both these conventions, that the House must be obeyed, and that the attorney's legal advice should be confidential, ought to be protected, and that's a possible way of reconciling
Well, I'm grateful for the advice of the Father of the House, but he will appreciate that the Right Honourable Gentleman opposite wants all legal advice to be put into the public domain without any attempt at protecting the national interest whatsoever. And what he will appreciate, I won't give way for a while, the consequences of not following the principles of transparency on the one hand and safeguarding public interest on the other are very obvious. The House could request, by way of a humble address, information that could compromise national security. It would mean releasing information with no method for the House itself to review or assess the information in question before its full release into the public domain. It would not be possible under the humble address procedure to weigh up any potential consequences of such a disclosure. It is simply an irresponsible thing to do. Turning to the present case concerning law officers' advice. As this House is aware, this is the subject of very long-standing conventions which are enshrined in the Ministerial Code and recognised in Erskine May. Firstly, without the authorisation of the law officers, the fact that, or whether indeed their advice has been provided to government, should not be disclosed. Secondly, such advice must not be provided to those outside of government without the law officers' express authorisation. The purpose of these conventions are to provide the best possible guarantee that government business is conducted in the light of full and frank legal advice. This is a fundamental principle of the rule of law. If government knew that it might be forced to disclose the advice that it had received, it could seriously compromise the sorts of requests for advice that would be made, and it would totally impede the ability of the law officers and government lawyers to provide it. In turn, that would seriously compromise good government. This motion we're debating today would undermine these vital conventions, and it does so through the blunt instrument of the humble address, an arcane parliamentary procedure which until very recently was last used in this way in the 19th century. Moreover, there is real doubt about the ambit of the procedure. As I said earlier, it contains no mechanism by which information can be reviewed to ensure that its disclosure does not seriously harm the public interest. So, in considering today's motion, honourable members must reflect carefully on this and on the potential consequences not just for this government, but for all future governments. As this House knows, the government has worked extremely hard to comply with humble addresses that have previously been passed. And we have also sought to do so in response to the current case that we're debating today, whilst at the same time taking steps to protect the national interest. The conventions that I've spoken about stand and endure because they respect the proper balance between the government and Parliament, and the principle that ministers should be as open with Parliament as it is possible to be, provided that disclosure of information does not compromise the wider public interest. We chip away at them at our peril. Today's motion is not in the interests of members, and it is definitely not in the national interest. What we break now may be very difficult to fix later. I turn now to the contempt motion itself.
Will the leader give way before moving on? I thank the leader for giving way. The leader has been commenting on the use of the humble address mechanism to compel the disclosure of information. We were told by the attorney yesterday this information would be prejudicial to the national interest. Isn't it impossible to debate openly in this House whether or not the information should be disclosed without knowing what that information is? And isn't it therefore more appropriate to make a decision about what may and may not be disclosed in some confidential tribunal analogous to a judge making that decision if a matter of disclosure arises in a court of law?
Well, again, my honourable friend points out the problem that the right honourable gentleman's motion seeks for all information to be provided into the public domain without any ability of anyone on any side of the House to consider whether that would be in the national interest to do so. So I do want to turn now to the contempt motion itself. We recognise that concerns have been raised as to whether the government's response meets the terms and spirit of the motion agreed on the 13th of November. We consider that the spirit and intent of that motion has been fully complied with. As I said earlier, the government has now provided a 48-page paper setting out the legal effect of the withdrawal agreement, and the Attorney-General came to this House yesterday. Anyone present in the chamber for his statement and his subsequent responses to questions can be in absolutely no doubt that the Attorney-General gave a full...
Order! The leader must resume her seat momentarily. Mr. Russell-Moyle, you are a very excitable denizen of the House. If you were on your feet, you would be entitled to express your views. When you are in your seat, you are not. I hope that basic rubric is now clear to you and will require no further explanation. The Leader of the House, Andrea Leadsom.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Anyone present in the chamber for the Attorney-General's statement and his subsequent responses to questions can be in absolutely no doubt that the Attorney-General gave a full and frank exposition of the legal position of the withdrawal agreement. I simply reject any suggestion that the Attorney-General has done anything other than treat this House with the greatest of respect. Turning to process, the motion before the House today seeks to find the government in contempt of Parliament without having taken the important prior step of referring the matter to the Committee of Privileges, as is normally the case. This is a matter of due process. Firstly, those facing this extremely serious charge of contempt should each be given the opportunity to make their case and to follow the due processes of this House. They should be given the opportunity to explain how they have come to their decision about how best to balance the government's responsibilities to Parliament with their ministerial duties, including the need to consider the national interest. That opportunity is a vital element of any such procedure. And in this mother of all parliaments, surely we are nothing if we don't uphold our own constitutional practices in the appropriate way. The Privileges Committee will also want to consider the question of compliance with the motion in its full constitutional and historical context. The Government would strongly welcome the committee having the opportunity to consider the more general scope of the motion for the humble address procedure, in particular as regards confidential information and the national interest. The committee could consider these complex matters in a full and impartial way, away from the heat of the present debate and in fulfilment of their parliamentary duty as established by this House. And I'm grateful to the Honourable Lady, the Chair of the committee, for the conversation she and I had today, where she agreed that her committee would be happy to consider that. The members of the committee are accustomed to the consideration of complex and contested issues. That is the very essence of their role. Although it would be for the House itself to reach a final determination on whether a contempt has been committed, it should do so on the basis of that full and impartial consideration of the facts by the Committee of Privileges. Therefore, I appeal to all of those honourable members right across this House that if they seek to pass this motion, they should refer it to the committee in line with our parliamentary procedures, and I urge all honourable members to support the government's amendment.
Oh, no, the original question was as on the order paper, since when the amendment has been proposed as on the order paper. The question is that the amendment be made. Sir William Cash.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I must say that I found the answers given by the Attorney-General yesterday extremely difficult to understand in the terms in which they were expressed relating to the national interest, when of course that is a question which is contained in the results of the referendum and the Withdrawal Act of 2018. I also found it very difficult on reports that I've heard that it's most unsatisfactory for this issue to be regarded as a parlour game, that we were told to stop messing around with the process. I have to say, and to grow up, I have to say that I do think that that somewhat underestimated the significance of what we are here dealing with. But I will leave it at that, because people in those circumstances do use language which sometimes perhaps underestimates the importance of the matters that are being dealt with. On the question of conventions, I would simply like to say to the Leader of the House, and indeed to the law officers, that the question of conventions does turn on the reason for the rule. Now, in this particular context, I would simply say that the reason for the application of this particular convention, which includes the question of the ministerial code, which I shall come on to in a moment, quite clearly demonstrates that unless you know what the Attorney-General has actually given by way of a full disclosure, that it is extremely difficult to know whether or not the public policy which has been pursued is consistent with the legal advice that he gave. Ivor Jennings is one of the greatest constitutional authorities on these matters, also says that conventions are observed because of the political difficulties that arise if they are not. I would suggest that nothing could better illustrate the current situation, and in particular the issues which I am about to deal with relating to the ministerial code itself. Under the ministerial code, it is essential that the law officers are consulted in good time before the government is committed, and I use the expression set out in the code, to critical decisions involving legal considerations. Now, I've been informed, because the Chequers proposals lies at the heart of the beginnings of the issues with which we are considering the withdrawal agreement, that the law officers were not consulted before the Chequers proposals, with dire consequences, including, as I said to the Prime Minister on the 9th of July, that I didn't think she would be able to reconcile the Chequers proposals with the express repeal of the European Communities Act 1972 in the 2018 Withdrawal Act. Now, this was passed on the 26th of June. 16 days passed, and then we were presented with the Chequers proposals. So everybody knew, when the Royal Assent was given, that the express repeal of the 1972 Act had actually been enacted, and yet it was quite clear, because it was only a few days later, that a white paper of 80 pages was produced, the effect of which was to demonstrate that the 1972 Act was going to be considerably altered. And therefore, I regarded that as a massive breach of trust, which could have been resolved if we had the full advice of the Attorney-General at that time, at that moment. Now, under the same convention, and with respect to this present withdrawal agreement, it is essential for us to know now whether the present Attorney-General gave advice on the issue of incompatibility between the expressed repeal of that 1972 Act in the Withdrawal Act itself and the withdrawal agreement itself. Now, in the introduction that he gave to his legal statement yesterday, there is no indication that he addressed that question as a matter of fundamental constitutional importance. Indeed, it does state that the agreement needs a new Act of Parliament in domestic law. But as I pointed out in the Sunday Telegraph, this is no more than a wing and a prayer. I asked the Prime Minister about these matters during her statement last Monday and also in the liaison committee, to which I received no satisfactory answers. I also asked the Attorney General yesterday a similar question, and I asked him to draw his own attention to a Queen's Bench division which was cited as a precedent for the disclosure of the Attorney General's advice. There are 4 other precedents, but factor tame is particularly significant because of the incompatibility between the 1972 Act and the Withdrawal Agreement. So what I'd say to you, Mr. Speaker, is simply this, that if we do not have the full disclosure of the opinion of the Attorney General, this is relevant to the question of whether or not the actual withdrawal agreement itself is invalid under the Vienna Convention, because a fundamental failure to comply with internal domestic constitutional law does amount to grounds for the invalidity of such a withdrawal agreement. And I would simply say, just one moment, I would simply say this, that if there is a danger of invalidity of that withdrawal agreement, this is a matter of fundamental importance on which I would have expected the Attorney General to include his opinion in relation to this withdrawal agreement. But there is no evidence whatsoever that he has referred to that in his opinion, and that is why we need to have its full disclosure. I also understand that there are, from within governmental circles, that there are sheaves of papers unpacking the repeal of the 1972 Act with respect to the prospective withdrawal and implementation bill, which again is a matter of extreme public importance. By any standards, all these matters fall not only within the ministerial code, but also within what I would have hoped and expected the Attorney General would deal with in relation to his opinion and the statements he gave yesterday, but there was nothing there to give me any comfort whatsoever. So I do think that to say that we should move on and that we should get real and that what he thought was in the national interest does also bear on the question of whether, in fact, the Withdrawal Act of 2018 is not a matter of extreme public interest and fundamental importance. And the failure to address that question in the introduction and in the legal statement does seem to me to be a mistake of the first order, and furthermore to be inconsistent with what I would have expected from the legal opinion of the Attorney General. Could I just add this? As to the role of the Attorney General, I simply refer to the authoritative work, The Attorney General, Politics and the Public Interest, published in 1984 and written by Professor John Edwards. In his chapter dealing with ministerial consultations with the law officers, it is made clear that all the legal advisers from all departments in the whole of government ultimately will turn on the view of the Attorney General. As he states, there will be times when the departments proposed, when the Attorney General, perceiving the legal implications of a department's proposed course of action, in this case number 10, and the Department of DEXU, will find it necessary to oppose himself a minister's preferred policy. And such opposition must also derive from the legal implications of the proposed policy. For the government, he says, in this authoritative work, to reject such advice would be quite exceptional and would reasonably lead to serious questioning by the Attorney General himself of his continuing to serve as the government's chief legal adviser. That appears on page 190. Without full public disclosure of his opinion, it will be impossible to get to the bottom of all these considerations, which are at the heart of the issue of public trust, to which the Secretary of State referred regarding the manifesto of 1985 and the reasons for his resignation, and the conduct of the government, to which I have referred myself in terms of broken promises by the government in the House recently. I would simply add that the reason why my European Scrutiny Committee is making a full inquiry into this, in a nutshell, is this: that we want to get to the bottom of the conduct and the processes and the outcome of these negotiations, and we will do so by taking evidence, and I trust that the government will take note of the seriousness of the suggestions and the arguments that I'm putting forward, because they go to the heart of public trust, the referendum vote itself, the repeal of the 1972 Act, and also whether or not the Attorney-General has fully addressed, in an opinion to which we have a right, in my opinion, to see, the consequences for the withdrawal agreement of the opinion that he has given, and the question of whether or not it is really in the public interest for it not to be disclosed.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I start by commending those honourable and right honourable members who secured this debate, and thanking you for allowing it. Can I also pay tribute to the stamina of my honourable friend from North East Fife and others of my colleagues who last night assured that you would have ample time to consider the response to the original application. Mr. Speaker, later today, we begin 5 days of debate on possibly the most important peacetime decision this Parliament will ever take. Today also, Ofsted has described the government's treatment of thousands of vulnerable school children in England as a national scandal. We have a major investigation into the alleged profiteering with funeral companies. We've had reports from a UN Special Rapporteur and the Joseph Rowntree Foundation highlighting the appalling poverty that exists in this, one of the wealthiest economies in the world. What's that got to do with the motion before us just now, Mr. Speaker? Because the only reason that we are allowed to discuss those things openly and without fear, indeed the only reason we're allowed to know most of those things, is because the power of the state to stop us from knowing is tempered by the rights of a democratically elected Parliament. Not tempered nearly enough, in my humble opinion. The Parliament is not democratically enough elected, in my humble opinion. But we do have an elected Parliament to hold back on the excesses of the state, to hold back on the excesses of the government. And that is what today's motion is all about. A Parliament of 650 people, each one of us entrusted to exercise sovereignty on behalf of those who sent us here. A contempt of this Parliament is a contempt for the fundamental principle of the sovereignty of the people. A contempt for this Parliament is a contempt for the people. A government that seeks to place itself above the express will of this Parliament is a government in contempt of the people, and it is a government that has already taken a dangerous step down the road from democracy towards dictatorship. And today's debate is not about the rights and wrongs of the original motion as presented to the House on the 13th of November, because, astonishingly enough, the time for debate on those questions was the 13th of November. So let's not spend time today on questions of convention and precedence, of confidentiality of legal advice, and of when that confidentiality should be waived. The time for that debate has gone. The time for opposition to the terms of that motion was when you, Mr. Speaker, called the question. And at that point, the government instructed its members to do nothing. The government instructed its members not to oppose that motion. I welcome the degree of humility they're shown in now admitting that they got it wrong. But the government having got it wrong is not an excuse for the government unilaterally to seek to change the wording or the meaning behind a decision, a binding decision that has been made by this Parliament. The government seem to decide that they can change that meaning. They've got the audacity to come back here yesterday and today and tell Parliament that they, and not Parliament, know what it was that Parliament decided and know what it was that Parliament meant when they took that decision. Mr. Speaker, they are placing themselves above Parliament. They are placing themselves in contempt of Parliament. And as for the legal position document published yesterday that was going to fix it all, that could hardly have been more patronising. if they'd had pictures to colour in and me join the dots puzzles every so often just to keep us interested. It was not a legal position by any accepted definition of those terms. It was an attempted sop, possibly at some of their own MPs, who I know are in a very difficult position just now, struggling between their understandable loyalty to their government, to their party, to individual ministers, and their overriding loyalty to the people and to this Parliament. And as the Right Honourable Member for Holborn St Pancras has pointed out, the Government have made a habit of not turning up if they think they're going to lose. Maybe the problem is they get so used to being allowed to ignore the views and the opinions of Parliament, they forgot that sometimes Parliament takes decisions that they are not allowed to ignore. Maybe that's why they're so upset now. Maybe it's because, alongside the issues about what and should not be made available to members of Parliament or to the public, maybe it's because this decision has laid bare the incompetence at the heart of a government that doesn't even know the basics of parliamentary procedure. I'll give way here.
I thank the honourable gentleman for giving way, and I'm just wondering if this commitment to openness now means that he will be asking the Scottish legal officer to publish all of her advice in the Scottish Parliament in future.
Yes, because and the relevance of that is the debate.
Mr Speaker, I have absolutely no doubt that if the Parliament that represents the sovereign people of Scotland gives a binding direction to the elected government of Scotland, the elected government of Scotland will comply with that binding direction. No such binding direction has been given. But let's not, Mr Speaker, let's not try to deflect attention from the clear and blatant contempt that has been committed against this House with completely false accusations of contempt elsewhere. Mr Speaker, we have a government who are behaving like a football team that doesn't turn up for friendlies if they think they're going to get beat. And then they discover they've missed a cup final and they've forfeited the tie with a notional 3-0 score. They're now back here not only being asked to be allowed to replay the final, but they're complaining that the score's void because the 3 notional goals would all be offside if there had been anybody there to defend them. But Mr Speaker, we're not talking about a game of football with trophies at stake. We're not talking about the sanctity or non-sanctity of the confidentiality of legal advice. We're talking about the most fundamental principle. We're talking about the most fundamental principle that governs our nations. The principle that Parliament can tell the government what to do, not the other way around. And this is not just some temporary individual aberration. It's part of a pattern of government attempts to keep Parliament out of this altogether, restoring sovereignty to Parliament by keeping Parliament out of its own sovereignty. They went to the Supreme Court to stop us having any say on the triggering of Article 50, and they lost. They did their damnedest in here to stop Parliament having any say in the withdrawal agreement, and they lost. They spent thousands of pounds of our money trying to stop a group of Scottish parliamentarians from finding out whether or not Article 50 can be unilaterally revoked, and they lost. The European Court almost certainly now will find that it can be. And I want to pay tribute to the parliamentarians from 5 political parties and 3 national parliaments who brought that decision to the court. I believe that what they have won will prove to be a pivotal victory. But it does raise a question that's too important to be treated as rhetorical, and it raises a question that's highly pertinent to the substance of today's debate. What kind of government goes to court to stop its own citizens from knowing that the government has legal powers but has chosen not to use them? What legitimate reason can there be for a government to want its people to believe that something is legally impossible when the government has already got its own legal advice telling them that it is perfectly possible? Mr Speaker, I refer to this morning's preliminary opinion from the Court of Justice of the EU as simply another example of this government's attitude that the path chosen usually unilaterally by the government is the only one worthy of consideration, and that nobody is even allowed to know that other paths might be possible. They've got their priorities completely wrong, Mr Speaker. They repeatedly tell us, and the Leader of the House said often enough again in her comments, that their ultimate duty is to act in the public interest. But in fact, We have a government that demands that Parliament and the public act at all times in the government's interests, and that is not the same thing at all. The government has taken on itself the right to decide what's in the public interest, not the Parliament that holds sovereignty on behalf of the public. The government declares itself to know better than Parliament what is in the public interest. The government places itself above the decisions of Parliament. Mr. Speaker, the government places itself in contempt of Parliament. Early next year, we'll see the 370th anniversary of the day when a Crown King of Scots was executed just a few hundred yards up the road from here for defying the will, not of this Parliament, because this Parliament didn't exist then, but of one of its predecessors. Now, I don't think anyone's suggesting a similar fate for those who are found in contempt of this Parliament, but we should be under no illusions about the gravity of what we're discussing. And we should be under no illusions as to how the mockery from the Conservative benches is being perceived by those who believe that this Parliament should actually be allowed to tell the government what to do. The elected parliaments of our four nations, for all the faults and the flaws and the imperfections and the ridiculously outdated procedures and the arcane procedures that the Leader of the House sometimes doesn't like, represent the rights of our citizens. No one, but no one, has the right to wield power over the people without the consent of the people. In a parliamentary democracy, that consent is expressed through Parliament, not through the office of the Prime Minister or any other holder of the offices of state. When Parliament speaks, it speaks on behalf of the people, and the government must listen. And when Parliament instructs on behalf of the people, and the government must comply. Mr. Speaker, Parliament has spoken. The government must listen. Parliament has instructed. It has not asked, it has not opined, it has not suggested, it has instructed. The government can disagree or moan or complain as much as they like, but they must comply with that instruction of Parliament. Instead, the government seeks to defy the instruction of Parliament. They seek to defy the sovereignty of the people as expressed through their elected representatives. And it is now, Mr. Speaker, for Parliament to take the only course of action open to us, to compel the government to back down.
Nadine Dorries.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I'll just make my apologies before I start that I do have to leave to chair the finance bill, and so I do have to absent the chamber quickly. I just want to begin my points, which I will make very short, by referring to the Right Honourable Member for Carl Shulton and Wallington, the Right Honourable Member, and comments that he made on the radio this morning when he discussed the Iraq War debate and the legal advice that was issued and what is happening now, and actually conflated the two, because of course the advice that was issued wrongly by the previous administration, which actually resulted in members in this House going into the lobbies misinformed and without the required information, was about the legalities of the Iraq War, whereas this, as the Attorney-General made clear yesterday, is a political decision, not a legal. No, I'm not going to give way because I have to go. I haven't got time. Sorry. Obviously, yeah. But
thank her for giving way. She's very generous. Can I just point out to her the only point I was making? The comparison was about the risk of cherry-picking. And I don't think anyone would argue that the Iraq War and the position that was set out by Lord Goldsmith actually cherry-picked that advice to maximise the government's position and to press its case.
I do believe that the two issues were conflated, and that this was used as a basis to argue that for the revealing of the legal information now on a wrong predication. I would just like to make that point. I'd also like to go on next to my point about the civil servants and the legal advice that the government receives. You know, Mr. Speaker, I have been in a quandary about this and about this vote today. I would like to see the full legal evidence, as I'm sure everybody in the House would. But there are conventions and also other people to consider, and civil servants fall into that category. They serve us all with true independence, absolute independence. And I don't know where any government ever would be in this place if we could not depend absolutely
on the impartiality that we received, of the legal advice that we received from those civil servants. And if this motion is passed today, if this amendment passes today, what civil servant, what legal adviser would ever want to advise any government in the future without first putting in place a filter of self-preservation, of considering that advice that they gave? Who would want to do that as a civil servant? And I think, although I would love to see this legal advice, we have a duty to consider others, the people who serve both the public and us. They are, I actually have 100% respect for civil servants. They work amazingly hard. They are truly independent. They serve us without any political bias, and I think that is something which should absolutely be considered. In terms of the public interest and the points the Attorney-General made yesterday, you know, none of us know if there are any issues, apart from the Attorney-General and the select few, none of us know if there are any issues in that legal advice which pertain to national intelligence, national security, or any other of those issues. And I only have to assume that when the Attorney-General spoke yesterday about public interest, he was talking in the much broader context. And Mrs. B, this is an important issue because in the course of law, and I think I'll just quote the Attorney-General yesterday, there is no procedure by which this House can have redactions or entertain circumstances in which it could weigh the competing public interest against the interest of disclosure as a judge would do. Yes. Now, given what happened with the publication of the summary of the legal advice during the Iraq War, this inevitability that's happening today should have been foreseen then, because we live in a changing world. We live in a world where people demand transparency, where they have a right to know all the full information. Mr. Speaker, I believe that a resolution should have been passed in this House to give powers to this House, because after all, Parliament is a court, to give powers and a process in this House whereby this House, probably via your office, Mr. Speaker, through the authority of your office, via the clerks, via independent judicial advice, should be able to take a decision and redact matters of national intelligence and security from legal advice so that people in this House can see legal advice. And I hope that as a result of what's happened today, and given that it will happen again in the future, the demands to see legal advice, that the House will now take some cognizance of this and decide to pass a resolution that will ensure that we don't find ourselves in this position again. Also, I'd just like to go on and say, Mr. Speaker, that we have been told the worst as far as I'm concerned. The Attorney-General pulled no punches. When he said there's nothing to see here, actually he told us what needed to be seen, and for me, I'll again quote his words. There is therefore no unilateral right for either party to terminate this agreement. This means that if no superseding agreement can be reached within the implementation period, the protocol would be activated and international law would subsist if negotiations are broken down. He told us the worst. We will be in the backstop in perpetuity. That was as bad as it gets. If we cannot withdraw from the backstop following the decision of this House, we are trapped, as somebody said, from a sedentary position yesterday. And I believe that no MP with any conscience, given with what the Attorney-General told us yesterday, could actually vote for the withdrawal agreement, because he pulled no punches. He told us the worst it can actually be. And I commend him for that. And I want to finish, because I have to, with with a comment about us. You know, I listened to the Right Honourable and Learned Gentleman for Holborn and St Pancras when he said those words at dispatch box. And one day, and I hope he's white in hair and long in tooth before he gets there, but he may be the Attorney-General. And his words may come back to haunt him at some time in the future. And I could see, I have watched him many times, and I could see that thought going through his eyes. As a legal advisor, formerly, to one of the most eminent law firms in the country, he knows full well, when he stands at that dispatch box, what he is saying and what he is doing. And I hope you never find yourself in the position that you have put our Attorney General in. And I would like to finish, Mr. Speaker, with this.
I don't quite understand why the honourable lady thinks that someone of my limited capabilities aspires to the high office of Attorney General. Nadine Dorries.
Absolutely, Mr. Becker. Mr. Speaker. And I should know better. I should know better. I apologise. I would like to finish with this, that we are all, before we are Attorney Generals, before we are Mr. Speakers, before we are French bench spokesmen, we are all MPs, we are all elected members. And I believe that both the Attorney General came to this dispatch box yesterday in both honour and in good faith and was honest. And the result of what will happen today, if this amendment is passed, that the integrity and the reputation and the honour of a good man will be traduced. And that will be a disgrace of this House to do that, because any one of us may one day be in that position. And God hope that it does not pass today for that reason.
Mr. Nigel Dodds.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Speaker. And it's a pleasure to follow the honourable lady, the member for Mid Bedfordshire. And I don't agree with the main thrust of what she said, but she did make some very, very useful and pertinent comments about what the Attorney General said yesterday in terms of the analysis of where we find ourselves. I agree with her and other honourable and right honourable members who have praised the Attorney General and his candour and his honour and what he has brought to this House yesterday in terms of more truthfulness, if I can say, about what this deal actually means, in contrast to others who have been prepared to say things to the press and media. He came here as a member of the Cabinet and told us some of the unvarnished truth about this agreement. So I do praise him for that and join with the honourable lady in what she has said, because when I went through the adjectives that he used in his devastating commentary yesterday about this deal being a calculated risk, unattractive, unsatisfactory, undesirable, that it did provide no unilateral exit clause for the United Kingdom, it was indefinite, no unilateral right to terminate. But he asked us to take it on trust that it would all never happen because, believe it or not, having spent 18 months negotiating all of this, the EU and the Irish government don't actually want to implement any of it. The fact is, Mr. Speaker, that despite all of the candour and all of what was said yesterday, the coming to this House and making, yes, 2.5 hours of an oral statement and taking all the questions and providing the reasoned position paper does not actually fulfil the order, the motion that was passed by this House, which was for the final and full advice provided by the Attorney General to the Cabinet to be published. Now, the Government may not like the fact that this was passed by this House, but it cannot simply wish it otherwise. During the course of the debate on the 13th of November, it argued that it would do precisely what it has now done. That was rejected by the House. The House passed a different motion. And it is not good enough now for ministers, and it's not particularly the Attorney General we single out, because he said himself in a statement yesterday that he wished that he wasn't in the position that he was in. But it is the government as a whole which is collectively responsible for deciding that it will simply ignore this binding effective motion and revert to doing what it said it would do during the debate. Well, quite frankly, Mr. Speaker, that cannot be allowed to stand. We've heard a lot of talk about precedent and about conventions of this House and respect for all of that. Well, surely this is one area where the government must respect the will of Parliament and simply cannot set it aside. The Father of the House, in his intervention earlier, made a very interesting and I think a positive contribution about a way round this. But it's interesting that the government didn't take that up. It didn't take it up during the course of this debate, and it hasn't taken it up previously. So clearly the government isn't interested, it appears, certainly hasn't said anything publicly up to now about taking that suggestion forward. What it has done is say, no, it doesn't matter what is said by this House, doesn't matter what other suggestions are out there, we are going to stick to the plan. They obviously have a grid somewhere where this is on the plan, that they will publish this reasoned summary position paper and have a statement, and that is it. Mr. Speaker, this House will have the final say, and I hope that it will reiterate what it has previously ordered on the 13th of November to be done. Now, we're told that this is unprecedented. There are, of course, it was said in the other place yesterday, that in exceptional circumstances, advice like this can be published. I've also heard the argument used that this is privileged. But, of course, privilege in the lawyer-client relationship belongs to the client, not the lawyer, not the person given the advice. The lawyer has a duty to protect the client's privilege, but the reality is that if the client waives that, then the lawyer, the provider of the advice, is quite at liberty to disclose. So this argument about privilege is a bogus argument. The Attorney-General says that he would wish to come out. The Attorney-General said yesterday, and the Leader of the House, I wish I could comply with the order of the House, but it's not in the national interest, not in the public interest. I'm afraid it's not the duty or the job of any government minister to decide that. The House has decided what it wishes to do, and it's not for a government minister to unilaterally override that with no good reason. I give way to the honourable gentleman.
The Right Honourable Gentleman is very kind to give way. He's a patriot, and I know that he therefore understands national security and the national interest. Would you agree with me, however, that quite probably within the legal advice that the Attorney-General gave to the government would have been an analysis of the strengths and weaknesses of the Irish government's position? And does he agree that to publish that in full would actually hand to the Irish government an advantage in any subsequent negotiation?
I'm tempted to say to the honourable gentleman, I think the massive advantage to the Irish government and other governments and to the European Commission is handed over in this withdrawal agreement in terms of future leverage over the negotiations. But I don't accept what he says, because the Attorney-General went on record yesterday as saying that there was nothing to see here, so there obviously is nothing of concern about national security in this. That's what he said himself. So I don't accept what he has said. The reality is, Mr. Speaker, that had the government, this debate was had on the 13th of November. That's right. The government had the choice to vote against and decided not to vote against because they feared that they would lose the vote. And it cannot be the case, that by abstaining from a vote on a humble address, that invalidates the motion, because that would be a very, very serious precedent to set indeed. So, Mr. Speaker, we have had the situation where some of this legal advice, as given by the Attorney to the Cabinet, and it's that advice that is crucial that we must have, has already been leaked by members of the Cabinet to the press and media. And the Attorney-General, I think, accepts that. So the reality is that members of the Cabinet have already released some of this advice given by the Attorney in terms to the Cabinet to members of the press and media. I think that the Attorney is somewhat stopped, if I may use a legal phrase, from saying that the rest of us, therefore, are not entitled to have that. I think if some members of the select media and press are entitled, then I think the members of this House are entitled to have this advice. I'll give way to my honourable friend.
Will you remember agree with me as well that if the government and the Prime Minister is going around the country trying to convince the populace that this is a good deal, that this approach, this secret approach, only confirms in people's minds that there is something to hide. And in fact, if anything, the government is scoring an own goal by refusing to publish this advice.
I thank my right honourable friend, and indeed that very point about the government actually scoring a massive own goal in its own terms has been made not from these benches but by a former cabinet minister on their own side and by many honourable members on the government benches. So the right honourable member sums it up for you. What is there to hide, given that the attorney has said there's nothing to see, given the fact that we have the clear motion passed in terms by this House? It is absolutely vital now that that is enforced and the bogus arguments against it are rejected.
Thank you. Mr. Dominic Grieve.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'm not sure that members of the public coming in to watch our debates would necessarily appreciate our role as the High Court of Parliament, but that is what we are. And by virtue of history, we've been given a whole range of powers enjoyed normally only by others of Her Majesty's courts, by which we both regulate our affairs, maintain our own privilege, which also means, by virtue of the Bill of Rights of 1689, that we can't be impugned in any other court, and have coercive powers for dealing with those who transgress in front of us. And that can include government ministers. The difficulty we have, I have to say, from having served on the Standards and Privileges Committee and also been a law officer, is that our powers are entirely archaic, almost completely unusable, and in many cases are so old-fashioned and antiquated that any attempt at using them would probably run foul of most modern principles of justice. And I'm afraid that this situation has been allowed to prevail for decade after decade by a mixture of a failure of the House to grip the problems it faces and, of course, the happy complacence of government that has known that, in reality, the teeth are not really present for this House to assert its authority. And nowhere do we see this come to a head more than with this issue. It's all very well criticising the Right Honourable Gentleman, the member for Holborn and St Pancras, that the instrument he's used is a blunt one, but there are only blunt instruments to be used. And he was fully entitled to table the motion he did and to seek from the government the documents that he wanted. And the government chose, I have to say, slightly to my surprise, Mr. Speaker, not even to oppose the motion, even though there were compelling arguments that could be presented, and indeed I can continue to be of that view, that the law officer's advice should not be published because it undermines the ability to provide proper confidential advice to government. That said, Mr. Speaker, the method that was adopted, and it may simply have been because of the speed with which the drafting took place, was undoubtedly very blunt. Given its ordinary meaning, the humble address, as I interpret it, extends not just to the Attorney-General's advice, but to every advice that was provided to government during the course of the 2.5 years of tortuous negotiations with the EU, provided through the civil service at any time about the development and impact of the withdrawal agreement. I have no doubt that most of that is unlikely to be of great relevance to what the House wanted to see, and, moreover, some of it may undoubtedly contain confidential material which, if put in the public domain, could well jeopardise the national interest. When I don't suppose, just to take an example, that this House would seriously contemplate requiring the government, for example, to disclose the name of agents working for MI5 or MI6. But you have to face the fact that this House does have the coercive power to make such a request. And this highlights the untrammelled nature of its sovereignty, but also the extent to which it can be open to abuse. In fact, during the course of the debate, the Right Honourable and Learned Gentleman, the member for Holborn and St Pancras, I think became aware that the terms of the motion were rather widely cast, because he restricted them at that point to seeking the final and full advice by the Attorney-General to the Cabinet concerning the terms of any withdrawal agreement. I simply make this point. Having been a law officer and supplied advice to government, it may surprise the House a little, but I've simply no idea if there ever was a final and full advice of the kind that was identified, because in my experience, the advice provided by law officers comes in a continuous stream of dribs and drabs, which by letter to the relevant department and to the Prime Minister and, if necessary, to the Cabinet, touches on a multiplicity of things without necessarily being drawn into a whole. So I have to say that what is being sought here is about as easy to measure as the length of a piece of string. It is not at all clear what it is that the motion is seeking to grab onto, although I do accept that insofar as the motion is seeking to acquire the original documents of some of the advice that was provided, it is manifestly clear that it has not been complied with. That is apparent. Now, faced with that problem, where should the House go? Of course, within this House there are going to be differences of view. The government wishes to protect its position, and the right honourable gentleman and all those on the opposition benches, and indeed some on my own benches, who wish either to embarrass the government or just want to see this information, are going to be profoundly dissatisfied. The question of the culpability of ministers is in any case not uniform. I say this in defence of my right honourable and learned friend, the Attorney-General. He is not a member of the Cabinet, although he attends Cabinet, and as the point has been made, he's covered by legal and professional privilege about disclosing the advice he provides to his client. The one person who cannot be blamed for this mess is him. He came along to provide as best an explanation as he could yesterday, but the fact is he is not responsible for making the decision as to whether the documents that the House wants are disclosed. I assume that may have been a collective decision of the Cabinet, although knowing the way the Cabinet works, I'm not even sure that that's necessarily the case. It may be an individual minister, or it may indeed be my right honourable friend, the Prime Minister. But whichever it is, this also emphasises the blunt nature of the instrument, which is then reflected in the motion that has been brought before the House today. Now, it may be seen to be getting the government a little off the hook, but referring this to the Committee of Privileges is not a stupid course of action. I'm afraid I can anticipate a little how it's likely to progress, because the Committee of Privileges in its session will immediately come to the awareness of just how